Aloha, ladies and gentlemen. This is a short introduction to your lawyer, David Cole. You haven't met him, most of you, and you won't get a bill from him. But he is your lawyer because he is in charge of legal strategy and litigation for the only organization that has as its entire mission protecting the rights of all of us that are inscribed in the United States Constitution. A footnote for those of you who do not recognize the legitimacy of the US presence in these islands. He's happy to represent anyone, including those who oppose US empire, and he has in his long and storied history as a lawyer of the people. Do you read a newspaper? Go to an art museum? Attend a protest? Get stopped by the police? Worry about whether what you're reading on the internet is being tracked by someone, or whether your emails are really private? Do you fret about loved ones who might be vulnerable for some reason? Drugs, mental illness, imprisonment, discrimination, unfairness at work? Unbeknownst to you, David Cole and his staff have litigated and strategized on your behalf. He has written books, 6, 7, 8, 9, where are we now? Books on a range of subjects: police misconduct, government overreaching, the war on terror, social movements and how they affect the course of constitutional interpretation. He's written countless op-eds, reaching a wide audience. He's testified before Congress and sued the heck out of the government, all to give meaning to the concepts of liberty, equality, freedom, justice. He started at the Center for Constitutional Rights. For those of you who don't know, that's a radical public interest cooperative that from back in the 60s and 70s was suing the US government, for instance, because the war in Vietnam was illegal. And even as he transitioned into the so-called life of the mind in the academy at Georgetown University, he continued litigating. He never stopped saying, "I'll see you in court," to the US government. Happy to sue them when our government was acting like a bully instead of an exemplar of democracy. He represented the artist Karen Finley when she was censored for using her body in art that condemned patriarchy. He represented Palestinian students when they were called terrorists, when in fact they were human rights activists. He did this kind of as a side job while he was teaching full-time with a full teaching load, and some of you professors here know what that means, and writing his many, many books and regular articles for the kinds of publications like the New York Review of Books and The Nation. If you've ever written for them, their editorial process is just mean, picky, and grueling. And to write for them over and over and over, they do serious fact-checking. And he did that regularly while litigating, while teaching. And it turns out all of that was just a warm-up for the work he's going to tell you about when we elected to office someone who announced, before he was even sworn in, all the ways in which he planned to violate the Constitution and Bill of Rights. And the ACLU responded with a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "We'll see you in court." And that is David Cole's new calling, and he wins a lot. But I would like to... I'd like to add a little footnote before I turn him loose on you. If you hear this bio about all the books and the major public interest litigation, often behind that kind of bio, there's a dark side. People who take on bullies for breakfast are sometimes bullies. People who produce prodigious amounts of widely acclaimed work, sometimes do this at the expense of their intimates or their staff. So here's something I want you to know about David Cole. He is a feminist who does almost all the cooking in his house, a loving parent and partner, likely to get the call from a distressed adult child first. He is a major nurturer of friendships. I am his friend because he reached out to me when I was too busy and less skilled at the art of making friends. And I am deeply, deeply grateful for that. He is a warm and loving human, an aficionado of the great books, of jazz, of beauty. And maybe that ultimately is all connected to his dogged pursuit of justice. May I present to you an amazing lawyer and a dear, dear friend, David Cole.
Oh my gosh. I think I've always wanted to be introduced by Mari Matsuda. And now I feel like I should just sit down because I can only go down from there. I often repeat something I heard Justice Brennan say when people give me very nice, over-the-top introductions. Justice Brennan used to say, I wish my parents could have been here to hear that. He said, my father would have been so proud and my mother would have believed it. But really, that was so super, super nice. And one of the real treats of coming out here to Hawaii is to see Chuck and Mari, who we just adored having at Georgetown for many, many years, and we're very sad to see them come back home to Hawaii. So I took the job with the ACLU as its legal director in the summer of 2016. So I want you to, think back to that time. I know it's hard, but think back to that time. And my predecessor in the job, a really fantastic lawyer and friend, Steve Shapiro, was in the job for 25 years. And when he stepped down, Anthony Romero, the executive director of the ACLU, came down to Washington and took me out to lunch to urge me to consider applying for the job. And his pitch to me was this. He said, David, this is a job, this is an offer you can't refuse. He said, you've been spending your entire career, 30-odd years, litigating constitutional cases, writing about the Constitution, teaching about the Constitution under a conservative majority Supreme Court. Just think what it would be like to lead the ACLU and its Supreme Court work under a liberal majority Supreme Court. Because this was the summer of 2016, and we all knew, including, as we learned from Michael Cohen yesterday, Donald Trump, we all knew that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And so she would then appoint Justice Scalia's successor, and for the first time in 40 years, and the first time in my career as a lawyer, we would have had a liberal Supreme Court. So of course I signed on the bottom line. I didn't put in any, conditional what-if clause, escape clause, because no one thought there was anything to escape. And I didn't start working right away because I was finishing teaching up in the fall at Georgetown, but I did ask the ACLU's project directors. We have projects that are focused on reproductive rights, on women's rights, on racial justice, on speech, on national security. I asked each of these projects to write up memos on how we could advance constitutional law in their domains under a more sympathetic Supreme Court. Well, those memos are are somewhere in the recycling bin. And the job obviously changed dramatically on November 8th, 2016. So we now have a president who is really, a kind of all-encompassing threat to what the ACLU stands for. And I think, in many respects, to what this country at its best stands for. He, based on the kinds of things that he promised as a candidate and the kinds of things he has done as a president, he is a threat to women's rights, to basic notions of due process, to immigrants' rights above all, to access to the ballot, to separation of powers, to religious freedom, to reproductive freedom, to racial justice, to criminal justice, and to dignity itself. That's a pretty big set of threats. And, I don't know about you, but I learned growing up that the American system of government deals with threats through separation of powers. And we have a president, and we have a Congress, and we have a court, and then we have the states, and that's how we check threats. But what do you do when one party controls the presidency, both houses of Congress in the first until the midterms, has a majority on the Supreme Court and 2/3 of the state legislatures? Well, then separation of powers in the formal sense is not very reliable. There are still checks within the system, and we've seen them in particular from the states, and particularly from the liberal states and the state attorneys general. And a big shout out to Hawaii for Hawaii versus Trump. And we've seen them, as I'll mention in a moment, from the courts, which have stood up to the president in a range of on a range of issues and in a range of areas. Some might say somewhat surprisingly, but I think they are, in a sense, doing their job. But I think what people, what you realize when you see that there's one-party control of so much of the formal checks and balances is that we need something else. And the something else, I think, is encapsulated really in our Constitution in the First Amendment. What the First Amendment protects is the other forces that check abuse of power, the non-governmental forces that check abuse of power. So what does it protect? It protects the right to speak. It protects the right to associate, to come together, to resist. It protects the right to petition the government. It protects the right of the academy, academic freedom. It protects the right of the press. And it protects the right of religions, normative communities that have independent norms that they can bring to bear in resisting governmental action. And so this is why when autocrats come to power, in wherever they come to power, whether it's Hungary or Poland or the United States, what they attack are those sources of checks. They attack the NGO community. They attack the academy. They attack the press. And if religion is a threat, they attack religion. So I think in many respects, the First Amendment, which we think about as an individual right, an individual freedom, is actually critical to the checks and balances of our society. The good news, I think, in this period is that American citizens recognize that American citizens, in the wake of Donald Trump's election, have not sat back, despondent, I mean, some are despondent, but they have not sat back. They have come forward. They have stood up. They have said, I'm not going to take this sitting down. I am going to stand up for what I believe in and fight back. And I am going to do so in conjunction with others through institutions that can be part of that resistance. And so you see that in so many ways, I think, since the election. You see it in the fact that the New York Times and the Washington Post have never had higher subscription rates in their history, because people recognize that those are critical to checking the abuse of power. You see it in support for non-governmental organizations that are fighting for the rights that President Trump threatens, whether they be immigrants' rights groups or Planned Parenthood or the Southern Poverty Law Center or the ACLU. We have all seen tremendous support from the citizens in this moment. People have come to us because they think this is a place where checks and balances can continue to exist. So what has it meant for the ACLU? Well, one thing is it's meant a tremendous rise in our membership. Before Donald Trump was elected, and maybe not quite as importantly, before I started working for the ACLU, we had 400,000 members. 400,000 members is pretty good. I'm sure we were the largest civil liberties organization in the world with 400,000 members. Today, we have 1.8 million members. And that's, just since I started working there. So my daughter tells me that there is a difference between correlation and causation. She learned that in her social science class. But I can take credit for at least one of those new members. My dad joined after I became the national legal director. But I guess probably Donald Trump can take credit for most of the others. But you see it also in the movements that have arisen in these 2 years. From the Women's March, probably the largest single march in this country's history, put together in the course of about 3 months by a ragtag ad hoc group of people who wanted to stand up and say, we don't approve of who is taking office. We saw it in the weekend of the Muslim ban, the first Muslim ban. Think back to that. It was just 1 week after President Trump took office. He decided to take a kind of tried and true tack. And that is, when you're seeking to abuse rights, when you're seeking to expand power, target the most vulnerable. And especially target foreigners, and target foreigners that you can paint with a broad negative brush. And that generally works. We did it in the Palmer raids after a series of terrorist bombings in the United States in 1919, and we went out and rounded up immigrants across this country, none of whom were involved in the bombing. All of the anti-communist measures were first directed at foreign nationals. They are the path of least resistance. And so Donald Trump did the same thing. He said, for my first exercise of authority, I'm going to go after foreigners, I'm going to go after Muslim foreigners, and I'm going to do it in the name of your security. And usually, they get away with that. George W. Bush got away with a lot of that. But this time, President Trump didn't get away with it. Thousands of Americans across this country got up off their couches on a weekend and went out to their airports to protest the Muslim ban. They did it in New York. I'm sure they did it here in Honolulu. They did it, in Omaha. People went out in large numbers and protested at airports that didn't even have any international traffic. And this is remarkable, I think, for two reasons. First, the people were standing up not for their own rights, but for the rights of others. For the rights of the demonized. They were standing up. And the second thing that's amazing about it is that they went out to airports. Now, I don't know about you, but the last place I want to be, unless I have to go somewhere, is at an airport. It's a soul-crushing environment. And yet, by the tens of thousands, people were out protesting. We filed the first challenge to the Muslim ban that night. The order was issued at about 3 o'clock on a Friday. By about 2 o'clock in the morning, Friday night, Saturday morning, we had filed the first action on behalf of 2 Iraqi men being held at JFK Airport under the Muslim ban. And the next night, Saturday night, in late January, we had an emergency hearing in a Brooklyn federal courthouse. So this is a Saturday night in February. It was cold, not 60 cold. I know you think 60 is cold, but really cold. And a remarkable thing happened. People started calling each other and saying, hey, what are you doing tonight? It's Saturday night. Hey, why don't we go down to the courthouse and stand out in the freezing cold for hours and see what happens? And they did. And there were thousands of people waiting for this judge to rule. And our lawyer walked out to announce that she had entered the first injunction against the Muslim ban. Incredible. But it didn't stop there. We saw it in the demonstrations across this country at town halls to defend Obamacare from the repeated efforts by Trump and the Republicans to repeal the Affordable Care Act. We saw it in the Me Too movement. Now, sexual harassment did not start with President Trump. Sexual harassment has been with us probably as long as there have been men and women, and yet it took this time, with this president, to create a movement to call for justice against sexual harassment of working women. And then we had Parkland, yet another in a sad, sobering, long litany of massacres that, again, have been with us for far too long in this country. There have been far too many of them for far too long. But this one generated a national movement of young people across this country to rise up and march for our lives and push for reasonable gun regulation. So I think that if any one of those things had happened in a 2-year period in America, we would be astounded. For all of them to happen in 1 2-year period, I think reflects this vibrancy, this engagement of the citizenry who are concerned and afraid and sometimes despondent about what they see coming, but not happy to sit back and let it happen, and instead are standing up and fighting for the principles that they believe in. And that is where our salvation lies. So we've seen it in the midterms already. In the midterms, we had and I will say, the ACLU, let me caveat, the ACLU is a nonpartisan organization. We have been around for 100 years. We are not Democratic or Republican. We have Republican members and Democratic members. We represent people who take very conservative views, as well as people who take very liberal views, as well as people who are right down the middle. If your rights are being violated, we defend you. So we are nonpartisan. But that said, the midterms, we saw a blue wave in response to the threat that President Trump poses to so many of the values that we care deeply about. Democrats picked up 40 seats in the House. That is the largest net gain for the party in a single election since 1947. They picked up 7 governorships and hundreds of state legislative positions. Now, I know here, I don't know that there were any to be picked up, but you're a special case. It's interesting that Mari Matsuda has lived in Hawaii and the District of Columbia, both places where there are only Democrats. I don't know. No, I think she also lived in California for a little while, where there might be 2 or 3 Republicans. So what have we done? What have we done, the ACLU, in response to these threats? So the first thing we did, and I think Avi mentioned it, was we took out a full-page ad right after President Trump was elected to say, "Dear President Trump, if you do the kinds of things that you promised you would do on the campaign trail, we'll see you in court." And we have done precisely that. We've sued him over the Muslim ban alongside Hawaii, and the court struck down the first Muslim ban. The court struck down the second Muslim ban. The lower courts struck down the third Muslim ban, which was a significantly reduced ban with substantially more waivers for people to actually be able to come into this country and get individualized consideration. And that ban, as we all know, was unfortunately upheld 5-4 by the Supreme Court. But we were successful in getting the first 2 struck down and narrowing what President Trump was ultimately able to do. We sued him over the transgender military ban, also enjoined by the lower courts. That injunction has now been stayed by the Supreme Court, which is not a very good sign. We have sued him over a host of other initiatives, and in virtually all, thus far, we have been successful. We sued him over denying contraceptive coverage to workers who happen to work for an employer who is ideologically opposed to contraception. The courts enjoined that policy. We sued him over the policy of punishing cities that adopt sanctuary policies. Sanctuary policies are policies that say, we're not going to enforce the federal government's immigration laws. Let the federal government enforce those immigration laws. It undermines our local enforcement efforts if we enforce the immigration laws. Well, Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump didn't like that, so they threatened revoking federal funding from cities that adopted those programs, and the courts have enjoined that threat. We sued him over separating families at the border as a way of deterring people from coming to this country. Probably the cruelest policy that the Trump administration has adopted, taking children as young as 1 year old from their mother's arms and holding them across the country in some other holding center, often not even recording, the connection between the mother and the child. I mean, they do a better job of keeping track of what luggage you put on the airline than the government took of taking children from their parents. We sued him over that family separation policy. The courts have enjoined it, and the vast majority of the families have been reunited through that effort. We sued him over his recent proposal to deny asylum to any person who comes to this country not through a port of entry. That is, comes to this country by crossing a border, not presenting themselves illegally. And he says, well, if you don't come here legally, you can't get asylum. The problem is that the statute that provides asylum says that asylum is available to anyone who has a fear of persecution, a credible fear of persecution abroad, regardless of whether they entered lawfully or not. And so he's acting just directly contrary to the Immigration Act, which recognizes that the obligation not to send people back to persecution overrides the enforcement of particular immigration laws, and the courts have enjoined that practice. We sued him over a policy of presumptively detaining asylum seekers when they come here. So what happens when an asylum seeker comes here, even if they come at a port of entry, is they first go through an initial interview called a credible fear interview. And if they pass that threshold, if a government official who's trained in this determines they have a credible fear of persecution, then they get a hearing before an immigration judge, which is more fulsome, and the judge then either grants them asylum or denies them asylum. And ordinarily, under prior presidents, those individuals who came here, who showed a credible threat of persecution abroad, who had an asylum hearing scheduled 3 months or 4 months or 5 months or 6 months out, were allowed to be here and live at large among us pending the resolution of their hearing. Why? Because what else are they going to do? They can't go home, or at least they presumptively can't go home because they've shown a credible fear of persecution. And we can't adjudicate their cases immediately. And there's no reason to believe that they pose any threat to us. And there's no reason to believe that they're going to flee because they've been told you've got a decent case and we just have to give you the time for a full hearing. And so prior administrations let them live in this country for the time that it took to get that hearing. The Trump administration adopted a policy of presumptively locking them up for the entire time it took to get the hearing, which could be 3 months, could be 4 months, could be 5 months, could be 6 months. In some instances, it's more than a year. And they're in detention, not because they've done anything wrong, not because there's any reason to believe they're going to flee, not because they pose any threat to anybody, but because the president wants to deter people from coming here. So we sued him for that policy, and the courts have enjoined it. We sued Jeff Sessions for changing the standard for asylum. You'll see there's a theme here. Changing the standard for asylum, increasing the standard for what people have to show when they are seeking asylum based on a threat of a fear of gang violence or domestic abuse at home. And so we sued to challenge that policy, also enjoined by the federal courts. Most recently, we sued him over seeking to add a citizenship question to the census. So why are they wanting to ask about citizenship on the census? There's one reason, and only one reason. It is to depress responses from immigrant communities. Because if you're asked about citizenship and you're an immigrant and you're not sure about your status, then you're not going to fill in that census form. And if you don't fill in that census form, then you're not counted. And if you're not counted, then your districts that have a lot of immigrants, which happen to be mostly urban districts, gets less representation in Congress and less representation in the state legislatures and less support in terms of federal funds, which are allocated on the basis of that census data. So it is designed to reduce the count, the accurate count of the census. We sued him over that change, and the courts have enjoined it. It's now going to the Supreme Court. We sued him over revoking DACA, from individuals who had been given DACA. And again, the courts have enjoined. DACA is the status that President Obama gave to young people who came here without any wrongdoing, but came here unlawfully. Their parents brought them here. They didn't have any ability to decide one way or another. They just came with their parents. And President Obama said, we're not going to deport those young people. And President Trump has tried to revoke it. The courts have enjoined him. We sued him over an effort to deport en masse people who came from countries with temporary protected status. The courts have enjoined it. We sued him over the Voter Integrity Commission, which he created right at the beginning. The voter integrity, I put the quote marks because integrity, I don't know. The Voter Integrity Commission was basically a commission that was designed to gin up the problem of voter fraud so that they could then employ their tactic of voter suppression. And so we sued him over that. We weren't the only ones who sued him over that. Many people sued over the Voter Integrity Commission, including a member of the commission himself sued. And eventually, the Trump administration disbanded the Voter Integrity Commission, saying there were just too many lawsuits. We sued him over detaining a U.S. citizen as an enemy combatant without charges for nearly a year. And in response to our suit, the government freed him. And then we sued him over the second most cruel policy that I think the Trump administration has adopted. That's a long list, but the second most cruel policy after family separation was a policy put in place by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which detains unaccompanied, undocumented minors. So young people who come here, they don't have a parent, they don't have status, they're detained in federal custody in various places around the country, and they're overseen by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. Well, the head of the Office of Refugee Resettlement under Trump is a guy who has no experience with refugees, no experience with resettlement, no experience with immigration, but is adamantly anti-abortion. And so he decided that he would implement a policy by which he would deny any woman, any teenager, because they are teenagers, who finds that she is pregnant, deny her her right to leave the facility, to go to a health care facility to get an abortion. He argued that the federal government doesn't want to facilitate abortion. There was no facilitation involved. The federal government wasn't paying for the abortion. It wasn't paying for the ride to the clinic to get the abortion. It was opening the gate. But he said, no, we won't open the gate. And we sued him over that. And again, the courts enjoined the president. And most recently, we've sued him over the fake emergency, along with Hawaii. So this is a pretty good record, right? I mean, we have been. And I think that that ought to give us some hope that the checks and balances are working to some degree. And we at the ACLU have gotten tremendous amount of support, I think, in part because we're doing well, and we're doing well in the courts because we've gotten so much support. So there have been a lot of I think a lot of high notes in this time of fighting back and of seeing how many people have come out to support us in our fight. Beginning with those thousands of people who were standing outside the courthouse to find out what the verdict was. I mean, that just doesn't happen in ACLU history, and there it was on the Muslim ban weekend. We have been supported by Facebook athons put on by Tina Fey and Tom Hanks, benefit concerts at the LA, Coliseum, headlined by Usher and other artists who are way too cool for me to ever have heard of them. Chrissy Teigen, who is a model married to John Legend, on Trump's birthday, which came around right after the family separation, put out a tweet saying, for Trump's birthday, I think he was turning, is it 71 or is he older than that? He's older than that, I think. Whatever, maybe 73. Trump is turning 73 today. To fight family separation, I'm donating $7,300 to the ACLU, and I want all of you to donate, it's kind of like, for the bar mitzvah, I want all of you to donate in denominations of 73 to the ACLU. And in one weekend, $1 million came in through small gifts online in response to that. Bitcoin, one of the founders of Bitcoin, gave us a large donation in Bitcoin. We don't know what to do with it, but one day I walked into my office, and there were all these in the hallway outside of my office. There was all these big boxes, and I go, what's going on here? And it was Vogue magazine had come to the ACLU to do a feature on women of the ACLU. And again, I can guarantee you, in the 100 years that we've been around, we have not had a Vogue feature. And what were the boxes there? The boxes were there because they weren't real confident that the women of the ACLU would be dressed up sufficiently for Vogue, so they brought whole outfits for them to wear. But really, the moment that I really felt like, okay, now we've arrived, was my wife, Nina Pillard, who's sitting here in the front row, was doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, which she does somewhat obsessively, with no help from me, I should say. And she says, hey, look at this. The clue is group that told President Trump, we'll see you in court. And so I said, well, I can help you with that one. The answer is ACLU. But that's when you know you've arrived, when you are the answer to a clue in the New York Times crossword puzzle. But we can't rely entirely on seeing him in the courts. I wrote a book the book came out the year before I took this job with the ACLU. It's called Engines of Liberty, and it talks about how constitutional law develops, and it argues that it is not through clever arguments made by smart lawyers in the Supreme Court. It's always good to have a clever lawyer up there making a smart argument for you in the Supreme Court, and I would not recommend you not having one up there, but that is not really how you win your cases. You win your cases in the area of constitutional law by engaging in movement politics, by engaging citizens in every forum that is available in strategic and incremental ways to change the debate so that you can make something that is unthinkable thinkable. And that's how marriage equality came to the United States. That's how the NRA got the right to bear arms recognized by the Supreme Court, and I'll say more about that in a moment. It is through that kind of action that liberty and constitutional rights actually get life. And so in response to the Trump administration and our new membership, 1.4 million new members, many of whom were very happy to get their ACLU card. Didn't do Michael Dukakis a lot of good, but now people are proud to be a card-carrying member of the ACLU. But but many people came to us and said, hey, we love the card, but we want to do something. And so we launched a grassroots network called People Power. I know it's a very 60s kind of a name, but the idea is, let's encourage people to be defenders of liberty in their local jurisdictions as volunteers for the ACLU. And we don't direct them, we facilitate activism. We make suggestions, we launch campaigns. The first campaign was a Sanctuary Cities campaign to get local activists to come together in people power groups and to urge their local cities to adopt immigrant-friendly policies. The second national campaign was, in the run-up to the midterms, was a Let People Vote campaign with a 50-state strategy. Each state, here's what you can do in your state to increase access to the vote, make it easier for people to register and the like. We also use it to get people out to demonstrations against family separation, against revoking DACA, against the Muslim ban, and the like. And remarkably, this is the first time the ACLU in 100 years has had a grassroots mobilization arm. Very exciting development. It went from 0 people, because it didn't exist, to 250,000 people power volunteers before we got to the midterms. 250, that's people who came together and took some action in support of civil liberties in a particular area in the name of people power and reported it to us. 250,000 people across this country in every state. There are people here in Hawaii. I was talking to somebody who said, "Hey, look what I got on my. I got a text. It said, hi, this is Rachel." Person had no idea who Rachel was. "Hi, this is Rachel. I'm part of People Power. David Cole's going to be speaking about defending liberty on Thursday at University of Hawaii. Let's show up." Right? So that's the kind of thing they're doing, which is great. So hopefully some of you came by virtue of People Power. But so it went from 0 to 250,000. That's before the midterms. Then we had the midterms. And boy, did we deploy people power during the midterms. So we launched another campaign. It was called ACLU Voter. And the slogan was, "Vote like your rights depend on it," because they do. And we did a little research, and we found that there are a lot of ACLU members who didn't vote in the last midterm. Oh, right, really? ACLU members not voting? That's what we said. And we thought, well, that's low-hanging fruit. We should be able to encourage them to vote. So we said, okay, here's the campaign. Let's get people power volunteers to write postcards, personal handwritten postcards, and then we'll gather the postcards and we will send them to those ACLU members who didn't vote in the last midterm, urging them to vote in this midterm. And so we said, well, maybe we can get 75,000 if we really get a lot of people putting their pens to the paper. So we printed up 75,000. Well, those went so quickly we had to print again and again and again. We ultimately got 700,000 handwritten postcards, which we then sent out to ACLU members, urging them to vote in the midterms. People Power volunteers also worked on getting petitions assigned to put amendments on the ballot, and I'll talk about that in a second, to call people, to get people out to vote, to knock on doors to urge people to vote. And through that engagement, which is local engagement, defending liberty, using the tools of democracy, we increased the size of People Power from 250,000 before the midterms to 550,000 after the midterms. That is the size of so we have about 2 million members, but we have 550,000 people who have taken action in the name of the ACLU in defense of liberty. And we use that in a variety of contexts during the midterms. Again, we are nonpartisan and we don't endorse or oppose candidates for office, but we can engage in education during elections, and we can also engage in support of referenda initiatives. So the big referenda initiative that we supported was the Florida initiative to re-enfranchise 1.4 million 1.4 million citizens of Florida who are disenfranchised for life because they were once incarcerated. And that was a big lift because, those 1.4 million people, pollsters will tell you they're more likely to vote Democratic than they are to vote Republican. And Florida, as you know, is a very closely divided state, approximately 50-50. That's why Bush versus Gore came out of Florida. That's why they had to recount the Senate and the governor's races this year in Florida, because it's so closely divided, 50-50. So in a 50-50 state, where you've got a ballot initiative that requires 60% of the vote to get approved, and that ballot initiative is likely to help one party more than the other, that's a tough ask. But we put $5 million into that effort. We put thousands of hours of people power volunteers into that effort, and we used our affiliations and our connections with conservative groups in Florida, with whom we are in a bipartisan coalition to reduce the harshness of the criminal justice system. It's one of the few things on which there is actually bipartisan consensus in this country. We are in a coalition with George Soros and the Koch brothers. Now, there's nothing else that will bring them together, but we have brought them together on criminal justice reform. The Tea Party is in that coalition, and the Center for American Progress, the sort of Democratic Party in waiting, is in that coalition. And we talked to them and said, look, this is an easy issue to demagogue on, but can you please urge your folks not to demagogue on this issue? And indeed, they didn't. And we ended up getting 65% of the vote, re-enfranchising 1.4 million people. We also got involved in some actual candidate elections, again, not to endorse or oppose, but to educate. And I'll give just one example. In Kansas, there's a guy named Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach from Kansas. He has been our nemesis for a long time. He is sort of the architect of both voter suppression and nativist anti-immigrant measures. So he is Trump's guy, right? And he's been tremendously effective at sort of getting his ideas out there, and they start in Kansas. So we've sued him in Kansas on multiple occasions. We had a suit against him that went to trial last year on the most onerous voter ID requirement in the country. You basically had to show your passport or your birth certificate to register to vote. Now, a lot of people don't have passports, and a lot of people, can't find their birth certificate, and particularly poor people and people of color, much less likely to have those documents. So we sued him over that, and he's the Secretary of State. Ordinarily, the Secretary of State, when he gets sued, is represented by the lawyers for the government. But Chris Kobach, he went to Harvard Law School, and he was a Rhodes Scholar, so he decided, you know what, I'm going to defend myself. So it was the ACLU against Chris Kobach, really, literally, in the courtroom. And by the end of the trial, it was about a week-long trial, by the end of the trial, he'd been held in contempt several times by the judge. And at the end of the trial, the judge ruled for us and ordered Chris Kobach to take remedial legal education. So Chris Kobach decides, well, I'm doing so well, I'm going to run for governor. And he was the strong odds-on favorite to win for governor. So we went into Kansas and we took out ads talking about Chris Kobach's trial experiences, so to speak. And again, not urging people to vote one way or the other, but just saying you should know what this man stands for and what a bad lawyer he is when you go into the voting booth. And Chris Kobach was defeated in the midterms. So, and I will say that in doing this work, this really a kind of ramped up political work, we are learning from others. And in particular, we are learning from the NRA. In my book, Engines of Liberty, that I studied the way that the NRA took the right to bear arms issue and succeeded on it. And you know, the right to bear arms is a newly recognized right. For about 100 years, the Supreme Court had said that there is no individual right to bear arms. The Second Amendment protects the right of states to have militias, but not of individuals to have guns. That was not the NRA's view. And so it said it undertook an effort to get that right recognized. And it was a major challenge. One sign of how major a challenge it was is in 1990, Warren Burger, the then retired former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Republican conservative, said about the right to bear arms, he said, the notion of an individual right to bear arms is one of the greatest frauds perpetrated on the American people in my lifetime. That was what Warren Burger said in 1990. By 2008, 18 years later, the Supreme Court had recognized a constitutional individual right to bear arms. How did that happen? How did they do that? You know, whether you like that right or despise that right, you got to admire the fact that they were able to turn that around. And how did they do that? They did that by using the tools of democracy. They did it in much the same way that marriage equality folks got marriage equality. They started in local settings. They energized activists at the local level. They worked in the states, and they started in the states that were most sympathetic. They started in Florida, which is sometimes called the gunshine state because it was so favorable to their views. And then they would get a right to bear arms statute or a constitutional amendment enacted in that state, and then they'd take it to Alabama, and then they'd go to Mississippi. And by the time they got this question went to the Supreme Court in 2008, I believe all 50 states, and maybe I'm wrong, now I'm here in Hawaii, I'm not sure, but I believe all 50 states, certainly virtually all 50 states, had recognized a right to bear arms in their state laws or their state constitutions, which makes it a much less of a tough lift for the Supreme Court to recognize it as a federal constitutional right. They also got Congress to recognize that there was an individual right to bear arms in a couple pieces of legislation, just preambles, didn't have any legal effect, but it was Congress on board. They got the executive branch. When George Bush won with the big support of the NRA, and John Ashcroft, a longtime NRA member, became the Attorney General, the first thing they did was write a letter to the Attorney General and say, Dear John, you know, what do you think about the fact that for 100 years, the Justice Department of the United States has said there is no individual right to bear arms? We think that's wrong. And John Ashcroft wrote back and said, by golly, you're right. It is wrong. And he reversed 100 years of precedent. And so the executive branch had taken a position in favor of a right to bear arms by the time this question went to the Supreme Court. And so you had the executive branch, you had Congress, you had the states, all behind it. But the way they got there was by energized activist members. They have 5 million members, and they have only one right they have to protect. We're proud that we have almost 2 million, but we got to protect all the rest of the Bill of Rights. And their members act. Their members respond when they are when asked, and that's the source of their power. That's why members of Congress vote their way, even when they might otherwise vote the other way. And even after the NRA essentially won the right to bear arms recognized by the Supreme Court, I would argue they are still today a more significant protector of the right to bear arms than the Supreme Court is, or the courts, because they are able to stop bills getting enacted, like universal background checks, that are clearly constitutional, and they're able to get laws enacted that are clearly not required by the Second Amendment. So, you know, that was a big symbolic victory for them, but in fact, their power comes from the use of the tools of democracy to defend liberty. And at the same time that I was studying that, and I will say, just one aside, there's a remarkable parallel between the way, and this is what I talk about in the book, between the campaign for marriage equality, a very different set of right with a very different set of supporters, but they used the same strategies. They started in the states, they started in local forums, they got people engaged, they worked incrementally, and they got momentum in the states before they took the question to the Supreme Court. And by the time they took it to the Supreme Court, it was sort of almost an inevitability that the court would recognize a right that had been rejected as crazy 20, 30 years earlier. So about the same time that I was researching that book, Anthony Romero, the executive director of the ACLU, had commissioned a study of the NRA. Because not because we agree with what their views are, but because we recognize that they are very effective. How can we be effective? And I think one of the lessons is to be effective as a defender of rights, you can't just rely on the courts. You have to rely on the people, and you have to get people to identify as defenders of that right. NRA members are so identified, and I think people power is getting ACLU members so identified. So I think that we are at a critical juncture in our country's history. And I think, 10 years from now, we could look back on this time and we could say, oh my God, it was the beginning of a downward spiral that really makes our country unrecognizable. That's possible. I think it's also possible that 10 years from now we say, oh my God, that was rough. But people stood up, people came together, people rallied in defense of the values that were under attack, and we reinvigorated a progressive, liberty and equality affirming movement in this country that reminded us of who we are when we are our best selves. So, I think, the answer to which one of those, will be the outcome 10 years down the line lies with us. It lies with whether we stand up and act or whether we sit back and complain. One of my favorite quotes comes, and I'll close with two quotes. One comes from a judge. His name is Learned Hand. He's said to be one of the greatest. He's said to be the greatest federal judge not to sit on the Supreme Court in this country. Now that my wife is a judge, I have to demur on that question. But he was asked in 1942, I believe, to give a speech to 110,000 newly naturalized citizens. There was so many newly naturalized citizens, and we were celebrating it, that we had it in Central Park. I mean, imagine the difference between that and what we see today with respect to immigrants. And they asked Judge Learned Hand to give a talk to these new citizens, and he called it The Spirit of Liberty. And in that talk, he said, liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no court, no constitution, no law can save it. While it lies there, it needs no court, no constitution, no law to uphold it. Now, like many great quotes, this is an overstatement. We need courts, we need constitution, we need the law. They remind us of our better selves, but it reflects a deep truth. And that is that the ultimate guardians of liberty are us. They are us. So it's up to us. And then finally, this is a quote that I've lived by for ever since I read it many, many years ago. It's in a book by Cornel West and Roberto Unger. It was called The Future of American Progressivism. It was a very, very thin book. But it had a tremendous insight. And they say in that book, hope is more the consequence of action than its cause. As the experience of the spectator favors fatalism, so the action of the agent produces hope. The action of the agent produces hope. And what they're saying, I think, is you're not born with a DNA for hope, and then you act. The causal link goes in the opposite way. It is by acting that you create hope. So we have two choices. We can sit back as spectators and favor fatalism, or we can act and produce hope. And to me, that means we have one choice. Thank you. Thank you.
Take some questions?
Yeah, sure.
You got him.
All right.
Thank you so much, David Cole. One of my favorite quotes attributed to Yogi Berra is, "If you come to a fork in the road, take it." And you've just suggested the synergy between lawyering and action. He didn't mean to run down legal education, by the way, if you thought there was any hint of that. And you said the distinction between correlation and causation is very important, but we can tell that you are a cause in the fight for noble causes. Thank you. David will take a few questions, though the hour is late.
Okay, so a few things. One is there are books outside by David Cole, and he'll be doing a book signing, so please know that that is an opportunity on your way out. In terms of questions, sorry, these are not wireless mics, so you have your choice of shouting out your question or coming up to the front and asking.
I would like to know your comment on the state judiciary quagmire concerning the former chief of police, Louis Kealoha, and the present prosecutor, Keith Katashiro, and 3 of his main deputies, which has only surfaced because the federal government has intervened.
Yeah, I think probably everybody in this room is more expert on that story than I am, so I'm going to defer on that particular scandal.
Aloha. I'd just like to know if the ACLU has a position on the extension of legal rights to the natural environment.
Thank you, Cher.
So I don't think we have a position as such on the extension of rights to the natural environment. I'm sure 99% of ACLU members are supporters of environmental responsibility and environmental laws. What we defend the rights in the Bill of Rights. We don't just defend the rights in the Bill of Rights. We also advocate for the extension of rights to those who are not reflected in the Bill of Rights. The disabled, for example, we played a major role in getting the laws that protect disabled people enacted. We extend statutory rights in the interest of equality, but we have not. We're not an all things progressive organization. We are an organization about essentially about liberty, equality, privacy, and dignity. The values that are captured in the Bill of Rights.
Any question on this side?
Where do you see the labor movement going in America?
Oh my gosh. So the labor movement is it's an interesting question from the standpoint of the ACLU. Interesting question because the ACLU was actually founded as a workers' rights organization back in 1920, and it believed in direct action on behalf of workers, and we have. And much of the work we did in the early decades that established First Amendment rights was defending the rights of workers to use the First Amendment to advocate for collective bargaining and to fight back against employers that were gouging them and subjecting them to unfair working conditions and the like. So we have long been associated with the rights of workers and have used the Constitution to protect the rights of workers. As to where the labor movement is going, again, I'm sure there are some labor historians here who know a whole heck of a lot more than I do. I will say that we were involved in a case last term called Janus, which involved a challenge to the practice by which, in a closed shop, when a union wins an election in a shop. Might win by 51% or might win by 75 to 25, but if it gets that majority and it becomes the recognized union for the unit, then all members of the unit have to pay dues to the union whether they voted for it or not. And the idea is that, well, they get benefits from the union because the union represents them in collective bargaining and in grievances and the like, and so they should have to pay for those benefits. They don't have to pay for any political activities that the union does because they have a First Amendment right not to do that. But the challenge was that's not enough. We shouldn't have to pay the dues at all to public sector unions. And we supported the public sector unions in that case. We lost 5-4. The court ruled that it was unconstitutional to require people to support the work of these unions that was in fact furthering their interests. It was said at the time that it would be the death knell of public sector unions. But in fact, what we have seen since the Janus decision is that membership in the public sector unions has not dropped, has actually increased in many places, and people are voluntarily paying those dues because they're being convinced that the union is an important institution for them. So, I think for unions, the challenge is for them to convince their constituents that they are as necessary as the free press, as the Planned Parenthood and the ACLU, as the NGO sector. It is to build up that sector. But it is a challenge, and we have a very hostile Supreme Court on anything that has to do with labor unions, and that's going to only get worse.
That side? Anyone? There we go.
Hi, it didn't dawn on me till your talk that the NRA is a defender of people's rights. Yeah. You mentioned you are learning from them. How much overlap is there between NRA members and ACLU members, and are you learning from them? Are they helping you actively from the inside?
Yeah. So we don't share membership lists with the NRA. And I'm not sure it would do us much good, but I think there's probably some overlap because there are libertarians who are strong NRA members and are also ACLU supporters, but there's not a lot of overlap, to be sure. I think most of our members are probably in favor of reasonable gun regulation, and we have a policy on the Second Amendment which says that we believe it permits reasonable gun regulation, which is essentially what the Supreme Court has said as well. So we sometimes work with the NRA. We have been in coalitions with them on challenging they supported us in challenging the telephone metadata collection. Remember that the NSA was doing, where they were basically collecting data on all of our phone calls and keeping them for years, so that they could, see who we were calling, when we were calling, how long we talked, and the like. And they actually supported us on that. We recently supported them in a case that they filed against Governor Cuomo in New York. And this was somewhat controversial within the ACLU, but Governor Cuomo doesn't like the NRA, just like lots of people don't like the NRA. But what Governor Cuomo did was he directed the head of his financial regulatory agency to reach out to all the banks and all the insurance companies and all the financial entities in New York that New York regulates, and urge them to reconsider doing business with the NRA or any other organization that promotes guns, and to consider the reputational risks of doing business with those groups. And so the NRA challenged that and said, you can criticize us, Governor Cuomo, but you can't use the regulatory authority of the state to try to blacklist us by using your power over banks to essentially ice us out. And we supported the NRA in that case because of the principle. Our view was, if you allow a governor to use the regulatory authority of the state to target a group, not because it's doing anything illegal, but because he doesn't like what it advocates, First Amendment protected activity, that's a dangerous precedent. What would the governor of Alabama do to Planned Parenthood if he could use his power in that way? And so we supported the NRA. We support them and work with them on matters of principle where we have aligned interests, but we obviously disagree on many other issues.
So this will be the last question, because David will be up all night signing those books with the amount of enthusiasm in the room. Please, a brief question and answer. Governor?
They're laughing about the brief part. I guess as one of the few individuals, let alone Democrats, that thought Donald Trump would sweep the Republican primary and would win the general election and win fairly handily because of the Electoral College situation. I'm very interested in the people power entity now that is underway. I wasn't familiar with it, and I'm certainly going to become a part of it, I can assure you.
All right, great.
But that's where my question, or my observation and my question. I think in the next 18 months or so, the next 2 years, the single most central issue that has to be faced by civil libertarians is the suppression of voters. I believe that the Trump administration, without going into the partisan part of it, the people who support him are going to institute and pursue every single possible angle they can on voter suppression. I think what happened in Georgia recently is a casebook study of the kind of thing that's going to take place over the next few months. So I would like to know, is there a game plan in the people power section of the ACLU for not just fighting voter suppression, but to move to support a voter enhancement, voter capabilities? In other words, not just fight against it, wait for something to happen, but get active, as you said, you have to be.
Yeah.
And if there isn't one at the present time, do you plan to have one? Because I think you will get lots and lots of people to go with you.
So first of all, if you predicted that Trump would win the primaries and the election, I'd like to have my retirement fund invested in whatever you think I should invest it in. Yes. The answer to that is yes. We have a voting rights project. It's one of the biggest parts of the ACLU, and it has a political side and it has a legal side. And the legal side fights voter suppression, mechanisms. We brought the census challenge. We've challenged voter ID laws. It also engages in voter enhancement litigation. The voter ID law is actually very good about making it easier for people to register, but a lot of states don't enforce it. And so we sue to make sure that they do enforce it, and we have gotten millions of people eligible for registration through that. And we also have used people power to fight for changing laws within each state to increase access to the vote. And I agree it's absolutely critical. And this is how I feel. Again, we are nonpartisan, but the person who is the president poses a tremendous threat to the values and norms that we favor. And here's the way I think about it in terms of 2020. I think Donald Trump won the election in 2016 not because there was some upsurge of Republican support for him that didn't exist before. He got the same number of votes as Romney and McCain 4 and 8 years earlier. So that's how many votes the Republican presidential candidate gets if he can stand up. All right? That's how many he gets. Hillary Clinton got 3 million fewer votes than Barack Obama in the 2 elections prior. That's what made the difference. It was Democrats who lost the election, not Republicans who won the election. So why did they lose the election? Because Democrats didn't turn out. Why didn't they turn out? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons, but part of it, I think, was, unlike you, they did not predict that Donald Trump would win. As we know, Donald Trump himself did not think that he would win. And so they thought, oh, it's a done deal. Number 2, I think they were turned off by Hillary in various ways, some of which, I think are sexist, and some of which are her her being too cozy with capitalism, and some of which are, the Bernie Sanders, showed up some of her weaknesses. A number of reasons, but basically people stayed home. And they thought they could stay home without cost. That won't happen again. I don't think that will happen again. I think we look at the midterm. The turnout in the midterms was huge compared to the prior midterm. And I think the turnout in 2020, when the president is actually on the line, on the Democratic side, will be as big as it was under Obama. Obama was a great get-out-the-vote candidate, right? But President Trump is a pretty good get-out-the-vote candidate for the Democratic side. So as long as the Democrats don't shoot themselves in the foot, which that's the big as long as, I'm hopeful that in 2020 we will have a leader who believes in women's rights, who believes in racial justice, who believes in criminal justice reform, and the like. Thank you all very much.